Phil, you need to unmute.
Right.
Yep.
Did anyone hear what I just said, or
No.
was it all silent? Okay. Can you hear me now? Excellent work. All right. So I was just saying thank you very much, Tom, for inviting me to speak to the AHSA New South Wales tonight. It's a great privilege, and I just was worrying that I might have been overexposing myself lately, because I've done a few of these talks, but it's very gratifying to see so many people have come along. So I really thank you for doing that. For the Victorian people who CAHS members, which I know there are a few here tonight, I did this presentation last year at the Airways Museum. So if you didn't see it, great. If you've seen it before, feel free to go and do something else. Go and commiserate over Joe Biden or something. Righty-ho. Just let me start this up. Always good to start at the start. Here we go. All right, so what I'm going to talk about tonight is the accident involving a DH-86, de Havilland DH-86, VHUSW, Uniform Sierra Whiskey, or would have been something else back then, I suppose, but better known as Lepena, belonging to Hollyman's Airways. Now, this accident, as it turned out, really wasn't an accident, other than it was unfortunately, the aircraft was unfortunately damaged in a precautionary landing. But it came on the heels of some other problems with the DH-86s, which led to directly to this accident. So I'll talk a little bit about that, and also the bigger context of the history of the DH-86. And this particular accident actually had some fairly far-reaching consequences, which I'll cover at the end. The other thing, or the other part of this presentation, is a fairly remarkable series of photographs of the recovery of the aeroplane from Hunter Island, where it made its forced landing. These were donated to the CAHS some years ago by the relatives of a chap who was Ron Larson, who was a boy aeronautical engineer, or apprentice mechanic, I suppose he would have been then, and later worked for the Department of Civil Aviation as an airworthiness inspector. And they show the recovery of the aeroplane, as I said, quite a remarkable series of photos. So, starting off with part one, we'll look at what happened on Friday the 13th of December 1935, perhaps an ominous date. So Hollyman's Airways, they were quite a decent concern back then. They're a Tasmanian-based shipping family, had established an airline. They could see the future, and they were operating services at this point between Tasmania and Victoria. The DH-86 Lepena took off from Launceston on a flight to Melbourne. It had a stop en route at King Island, or a planned stop at King Island, and then on to RAF Laverton, because Essendon, which was Melbourne Airport then, was being resurfaced at the time, so they were using Laverton. So as I said, the aircraft was VHUSW Lepena. At 9:15, it left Launceston, heading westbound along the north coast of Tasmania. The aircraft was pretty full because of a shipping strike at the time, and so they had a lot of freight and passengers that couldn't go by ship, so they chose to go by air. The crew of the aircraft were the chief pilot, Captain Alec Bain, and co-pilot Desmond Ditchburn, and they had 8 passengers on board. So just after 10:30 in the morning, they passed Hunter Island, which you can see on this map of northwestern Tasmania, just off the northwest coast of Tasmania. And just after they passed Hunter Island, Captain Bain noticed a gap between the base of the port outboard interplane strut and the fabric skin of the wing. Now, just to show you where that is, this is a photograph looking out along the port wing of a DH-86. This is the outer interplane strut, and this is the strut fairing here, which is a light gauge aluminium fairing. And Alec Baden could see a gap appearing in here between the bottom of the fairing and the wing skin. And he thought the strut had come off the spar of the wing. And obviously, that's probably not a good thing. And so he was quite worried that the wing might collapse at any moment. So they decided on an immediate return to Launceston. They sent a message by radio. They were in radio contact with Launceston Air Radio. They sent them a message telling them what had happened. But as they came back past Hunter Island, Bain thought that the problem seemed to be getting worse, and he decided to do a precautionary landing on Hunter Island. So the precautionary landing they did it went well, although Hunter Island, as we'll see in some of the photographs coming up, was very rugged. It's volcanic origin, and it's exposed to some pretty harsh weather coming in from the Southern Ocean. And I tried to put it down in what was later described as a pocket handkerchief-sized paddock, and everything went fine until the starboard tyre punctured, and that caused the wing to dig into the ground and the aeroplane to spin around, and so some of the wing suffered some damage. So there's a photograph of Lepena on Hunter Island, looking at the port wing. And as you can see here, I hope you can all see my cursor, the fairing is missing here, and this picture has been taken off, but it was there at the time because I should say, despite the fact that the aeroplane had ground looped and suffered some damage, all the passengers and crew were unharmed, so they were pretty lucky. And I guess it was a pretty skillful forced landing. So after they got out of the aircraft, obviously Bain and Ditchburn were keen to have a look at the wing and see what the problem was, and they went and had a look. And you can see here that, in fact, the strut is still firmly attached to the lower wing. And what they discovered was that the light metal fairing had come adrift, and it was moving up and down and creating the impression of a gap between the strut and the wing. So, in fact, there had been nothing structurally wrong with the aeroplane. Now, you might think, well, why did Bain panic? Oh, I'll just show you another photograph. This is the other side of the aeroplane. So you can see the starboard undercarriage has collapsed, and there's some damage here between the engines where the wings buckle. So why did Bain make a precipitous decision to put his aeroplane down on such a rugged bit of land instead of perhaps trying to go and land at Smithton where there was an aerodrome, which was the nearest aerodrome? So we'll come to why that was the case in a minute. To understand that, we need to look at what came before this accident in the history of the DH-86 in Australia. And we're going to look at the period 1934-1935. So this is 1935, this accident, at the end of 1935. So there'd been basically 2 years of history before that. So going back to the start, the DH-86 had been designed for Qantas, basically for the new international service that was going to open up. Qantas were going to operate from Brisbane up to Singapore to join with the Imperial Airways air service to the motherland, as most white Australians thought of it in those days. And Qantas had basically, Qantas and the Department of Civil Aviation, who were leading the contract for that service, had come up with a specification for an aircraft. One of the key features was that it had to have multiple engines, preferably 4 engines, for reliability over the Timor Sea, which was then considered a fairly lengthy stretch of open water. So the specification was given to de Havilland, who were one of the premier aeroplane designers in the UK at that time, or civil aircraft designers anyway, and they came up with the DH-86. So Qantas ordered 5 of those aircraft off the drawing board, but the aeroplane seemed to be quite a promising design, and Hollyman's Airways also decided to order it off the drawing board, as did Railway Air Services, a UK operator. Now, as it turned out, Qantas weren't the first operator in Australia. They were sent Lester Brain, who was the chief pilot, over to the UK to do some acceptance testing on the aircraft. And the aircraft had originally been designed, as you can see in this ad here. This was for an Imperial Airways aircraft, but you can see it's got a single pilot nose, quite a different shape to the one you can see on the right there, which is a Qantas aircraft. And Brain realised fairly quickly that a single pilot aeroplane wasn't going to cut it on the long route to Singapore. They needed to have 2 pilots so that they could share the flying, and also one of the pilots would be the radio operator as well. So they said to de Havilland, basically, you need to redesign the aeroplane with a 2-pilot cockpit, which de Havilland agreed to do. But while that was going on, Hollyman's had already ordered a couple of DH-86s, and the first one that they got had a single pilot nose. So just to show you, this is the cabin of one of the Hollyman's DH-86s. They are considered quite luxurious aeroplanes for the day. And you can see this one here has got the twin yokes of a 2-seat aircraft, which Hollyman's did later on get. So the first aircraft was the HURN, which they christened as Miss Hobart. And unfortunately, just 16 days after it entered service in October 1934, the aircraft disappeared off Wilson's Promontory. Now, this photograph, which I believe is an original photograph, probably hand-coloured, but an original photograph nevertheless, shows the aircraft. You can see it's got the distinctive single-pilot nose, and this is Redondo Island, which is an island just down off Wilson's Prom, quite ironically. Now, the aeroplane disappeared. I think they only found a few small parts of it, sort of got washed up on the beach, so there was nothing really to indicate what had happened to the aircraft. So they had an investigation, but because there was no evidence, they couldn't really pin it down. So there were various theories. One of them was that the 2 pilots were changing seats. So they had 2 pilots on board. Gilbert Jenkins, who was the chief pilot at the time for Hollyman's, and I've forgotten his name, one of the Hollyman brothers, who was the Victor Hollyman, who was the sort of the aviation interested one of the Hollyman brothers. He was also a pilot, although he wasn't qualified in the DH-86. And they think that Jenkins and Hollyman may have been switching positions, and they accidentally snagged one of the controls or something like that, and the aircraft crashed because of that. But as I say, there was no evidence really it was just a theory. There's no evidence to prove that. So that was a pretty shocking loss. I mean, 16 days into service, not very good. But, it could have just been one of those things. The problem was that very shortly afterwards, another DH-86 crashed in Australia. Now, as I said, Qantas had ordered 5 DH-86s. These were delayed in the UK, pending the redesign by de Havilland. So just as Hollyman's put their first DH-86 into service, Qantas ferried out, or actually Imperial Airways ferried out the first of the Qantas DH-86s. Sorry, I'll lead you astray there. Lester Brain, who had already ferried out one of the Qantas DH-86s, and that was up at Archerfield. They were using it for training and so on. The next 2 DH-86s were put on a ship to come out to Australia. The one after that was retained by de Havilland to do some more flight testing because Qantas had asked them to put flaps on the aeroplane to make it more suited to small aerodromes. So they needed in the UK to modify and test. And so it was actually the 5th aeroplane that Imperial Airways ferried out to Australia. And so it was an Imperial Airways crew ferrying out to VHUSG when it crashed shortly after takeoff from Longreach on the 13th of November 1934. So just a month after the Holleyman's DH-86 had disappeared. Now, this is a photograph of USG at Longreach, and you can see how the fuselage has been squashed flat. The aeroplane was observed to spin into the ground in a flat spin. And one of the crucial bits of evidence you can see just here by the rear fuselage is an engine. This was a spare Gypsy 6 engine that they were carrying in the rear fuselage in the cabin. That's been slung out of the fuselage in the accident. And you can also see here the fin. So this is the rudder, and this thing here is the fin. You can see how it's come adrift from its mounting at the front of the tailplane here and flopped over sideways. So when the wreckage was inspected, the first thing that they thought, because it had spun in and because the tail was damaged, they thought perhaps the tail had failed in flight. They did quite extensive testing on it and decided that in fact it hadn't come adrift, but that was one of the things they looked at. What doesn't seem to have really got any proper attention at the time was the fact that when Lester Brain had ferried out the first aircraft a couple of months earlier, he had an experience climbing out of, I think it might have been Tobruk, perhaps in Africa, or it might have been Benghazi, I can't remember. Somewhere in Africa anyway. They took off early in the morning. After they got airborne, Brain had handed over control to his co-pilot, who was an Imperial Airways chap who was just there for the ferry flight. And he'd gone back down the cabin to use the toilet, which was located right down the aft end of the aeroplane. And Brain was in the toilet and he felt the aeroplane lurch, and quickly, I guess, pulling his trousers up and running up to the front of the aeroplane, he saw the aeroplane was sort of rolling into an incipient spin, and he was able to correct it and recover the aircraft. But he had a strong suspicion then that the centre of gravity for the aeroplane and the design of the aircraft meant that it was directionally unstable, and that with an aft C of G, it was susceptible to going into a spin. But so even though he'd experienced that, he didn't quite, when Brain heard about the accident to USG at Longreach, one of the first things he asked was, where were the crew in the aeroplane? Where were they found? And it turned out that the co-pilot and the flight engineer that they were carrying, were sitting in the two control seats, and the captain, the Imperial Airways captain, was found in the toilet at the back of the aeroplane. And Brain put 2 and 2 together and said, this is probably what happened. They had the same problem we had. But nobody seems to really listen to him at that point about that issue and realise that the aeroplane was probably directionally unstable. However, the Air Accidents Investigation Commission in Australia commissioned some flight testing using one of the other Qantas aircraft, and those flight tests did show that the aeroplane did have directional stability problems. They also looked at a huge range of other issues with the aeroplane. There were some problems with the structure of the tailplane and the way it was designed, particularly with the elevator trimming gear, which was on a screw jack. Sorry, not the elevator, the rudder. Had a rudder trim was done by biasing the rudder, and that was on a screw jack, and it could distort the frame of the aircraft because it wasn't very well designed. And so they couldn't prove what had happened to the airplane, so they basically came up with a shotgun series of modifications to the aircraft, one of which was sealing the rudder servo. So the rudder had a servo tab to operate it, and sealing the gap between the rudder and the servo tab seemed to improve the directional stability problem of the aircraft. So they couldn't actually pin down exactly what had happened, so they modified the airplane in various ways and hoped that it was good enough, or that it had fixed the problem. So what I haven't really mentioned, going back a step, is that in terms of the certification of aeroplanes back in those days, particularly airliners, in the UK, the practice was the manufacturer would build a prototype. They would do their own flight testing, and when they were happy with the way the aeroplane flew, they would then give it to the Air Ministry, who would commission further flight testing at the Aeroplane and Armament Experimental Establishment at which was at Martlesham Heath back then. The RAF pilots at the ANAE would do a series of flight tests, write up a report, and then recommend the aeroplane to be given a type certificate. And that's exactly what happened with the DH-86. Now, the interesting thing is the DH-86 flight test program took 2 weeks from the time the aeroplane first flew to the time it was given a C of A. Now, we would look at that today and go, that's absolutely ridiculous. You cannot possibly test an aeroplane, particularly, you know, a major type like a 4-engine airliner, in 2 weeks. But they were absolutely pressed to the deadline for starting the International Air Service at the end of 1934, and de Havilland rushed it through, and the British authorities seem to have also rushed that through, but obviously with consequences later on. So that was the story. Qantas put the DH-86s into service. Eventually, I should say, when the USG crashed at Longreach, the Australian Department of Civil Aviation also seemed to have been a bit reluctant to intervene too dramatically. So they could have suspended the aircraft's type certificate in Australia, but they didn't. Instead, they reached an agreement with Qantas that Qantas wouldn't fly the airplanes on commercial services until such time as the department gave them the okay. And that's why in December 1934, the International Air Service actually opened using a DH-50 and a DH-61 flying out of Archerfield, and not a DH-86. And in fact, Qantas weren't able to use the DH-86 till, I think it was February the following year, when the department finally decided that they'd modified the aircraft enough and it was okay to use. So they operated for about a year. Hollyman's got a replacement aircraft, which was, as you can see here, one with a 2-pilot nose. And Qantas, they didn't get a replacement for the one that crashed, but they had their 4 other aircraft, and they were able to operate them quite successfully over that period. But on the 2nd of October 1935, about a year after the first accident, Hollyman's Airways other DH-86 BHURT Loiner crashed into the sea on approach to Flinders Island. Now, once again, the aircraft was seen to do what looked like a spin into the sea, although it wasn't actually seen to crash. They did an extensive search for wreckage and were able to pull up bits of the aircraft or recover bits of wreckage floating, but not the main structure of the aircraft. So once again, the authorities were left kind of guessing about what the cause of the accident was. But it was quite a shocking thing. So now we'd had 3 DH-86 accidents in Australia in the space of a year. So the Civil Aviation branch convened what they called a conference of experts. They got people from academia, from the CAB itself, from the RAAF, all well-respected people in the aeronautical field, and also people from the industry. They had people from Hollyman's and from Qantas as operators of the type. And the idea was to form this panel to go over all of the issues that had been uncovered with a fine-tooth comb to try and find out what was wrong with the aeroplane. As a part of that process, they commissioned some wind tunnel testing with models of the aircraft, and so this would have been some of the very first wind tunnel testing done in Australia. And also they did commission flight testing as well. Ironically, the aircraft they used to do the flight testing was Lepena. And this photograph here, which I used earlier, but this photograph is actually taken during that flight test program. Was taken with cameras mounted in the fuselage of the aircraft and looking out along the wings, and you can see on the struts we've got graduations here so that they could measure deflections, and down here they've got a quadrant to measure aileron deflection. So they had still cameras and movie cameras recording all of this. And one of the suspicions was the fact that the DH-86 had an innovative type of wing design, a single main spar without a rear spar. And that's why you can see there's only one strut on the outer wing panel there. There's only a single spar going through there. And there was a thought that because of that design, that at high speeds the wing might start to twist. I don't think there was any thought that the wing would actually disintegrate, but the thought was that if the wing twisted, you could suffer aileron reversal at a certain speed, and then that would lead to a loss of control, and that might have led to the accidents. And Gordon Berg, who was the chief airworthiness engineer for the CAB, was a very strong proponent of that particular theory. So they did this testing, and part of it was they operated the aeroplane at quite high speeds, and then they introduced aileron inputs, and they were looking to see whether the wing would twist because of that. And anyway, they proved that it wasn't really an issue. However, one of the things they did discover was, well, they decided there weren't any immediate airworthiness problems that they could find, and they did note, though, that the aircraft had an exceedingly violent stall and could easily slip into an incipient spin. Now, part of the certification testing for aircraft of this type didn't include spin testing, so the aircraft was not designed to be spun, so it had never been tested in that regime. So that was a bit of an open sort of question mark at that time. So we're going to leave that airworthiness stuff there for the moment and have a look at the salvage operation which occurred while all of this was going on, so in January, February of 1936. So Hollyman's Airways actually had only partly insured the aeroplane, and they thought the cost of recovering it from Hunter Island was going to be so great that it would be uneconomical. They were just going to leave the aeroplane there, or at least they were thinking about doing that. But their insurers, the British Aviation Insurance Company, decided, no, we're going to recover it and rebuild it. So the insurance company contracted Matthews Aviation, and an operator at Essendon Airport, quite well known in the day, to go and salvage the aircraft. So this photograph here is quite a historic one. We've got on the left is Horace Brinsmead, who was the first controller of civil aviation. Scotty Allen here in his guise as a pilot for, whoops, what happened there? Guise as a pilot for Australia National Airways. This chap here on third from the left is Skipper Matthews. He was the chap who owned Matthews Aviation. And on the right is A. Murray Jones, who was at the time the superintendent of aircraft for the Department of for the CAB, but later on went to de Havilland, Australia, as the manager. And he had a hand in the DH-86 story as well. Okay, so these are Ron Larson's photos. Ron was a boy apprentice with Matthews at the time, just starting out. I think he was 14 or something. And he took his camera with him to Hunter Island as they went to salvage the aeroplane. So these are quite a remarkable series of photos, as I said before. So the first job they did was to remove the engines from the aircraft, and you can see them starting to do that there. The propellers have been removed already. They had no machinery at all, and we'll see a bit later on the difficulty they had to get any tools up to the aircraft. So basically they could only use what they could carry with them. So they've set up a shear leg here with pulleys and so on to lower the engines out of the aircraft. No OH&S stuff in those days. Just climb up on the wing and get on with it. The next step was dismantling the wings. You can see the port outer upper wing has been removed, and this chap here with the hammer seems to be about to start work on the lower wing. You can see some buckling in here too, and towards the centre section. Here's some of the chaps with various bits and pieces removed from the aircraft. I think this might be down towards the beach where they had to carry everything. So you could only get to the aeroplane either. There was space to land a light aircraft on Hunter Island, and in fact, a couple of aircraft had gone to the site early on in the piece. But for shifting heavy gear, the only way you could get stuff on and off the island was by ship. So they chartered a ketch called the Lepena, and they used it to bring the chaps and their equipment to the island, and then they were using it to remove the bits of the aeroplane. So up here we've got bits of aluminium sheet metal work, so cowlings and things like that. There's an engine. You can see they've taken the cylinders off it, probably to reduce the weight. There's another bit of cowling. There's a nose bowl for the engine, and so on. This is a photograph on the beach. This is, I think, the stuff that they brought in to help them dismantle the aeroplane. The bits of, I don't know, I guess that's probably water or something maybe. You can see the box here is addressed to Matthews Hunter, and these wheels were for a cart, which we'll see in a minute, and for a dolly to actually move the aeroplane. So this is the kind of terrain that they had to work through. It's very, very thick scrub. There's a couple of these young lads here with a box slung on a pole. So everything had to be manhandled in and out of the accident site. Here are the chaps with one of the engines. They've made a little hand cart, and there's the engine lying on its side with some bits of cowling and so on tied to the top. So this area is, I believe this is around the aeroplane. You can see it's a little bit more open and less sort of rugged than the terrain we were looking at before. So here's another stage of dismantling the aeroplane. You can see they didn't take a lot of care with some of what they were doing. So the starboard wing's pretty much gone completely. The port wing's still in place at this stage. And here's the port wing gone now, and the very front of the nose as well has been removed. And when they got it down to just the fuselage, they put these little dolly wheels on the centre section extensions and hand dragged the aeroplane through the scrub to the beach. Now you can imagine how much fun that would have been. Here they are. And this photograph, I believe this is the Lepena, looking at it from the cliff top. So everything, when they got it to the cliff top, they had to lower everything down to the beach, and then to get it out to the boat, they had to float either the small bits, obviously they could put in a boat and row them out. The larger bits they had to float out on drums and things like that. So it was quite a rigmarole to recover the aeroplane. So that's the recovery process, and we've talked about some of the airworthiness issues that were bubbling away at the same time. So now let's look at how all of this played out. As for the aeroplane itself, the issue is looking spick and span. In 1936, so the aeroplane crashed at the end of 1935. It was taken back to Melbourne in early 36, rebuilt. And then when Hollyman's became Australian National Airways, the aeroplane transferred to ANA. So you can see here, this is probably when it was brand new. Still got the Hollyman's Airways flag on the tail there. In 1940, it was impressed into the RAAF as A314, served in Australia for a while, till 1942, when the aircraft was temporarily leased to Qantas as back in its own original guise as VHUSW, and it was used to replace one of Qantas's DH-86s that had crashed on takeoff from Archerfield in February 1942. So Qantas was still using, I can't remember, it was one DH-86, maybe two, on their internal services in Queensland at the time, because obviously they'd gone to the Empire flying boats by then for the international service. Well, that had been suspended during the war, but they still retained one of their DH-86s. At the end of the war, the aeroplane was purchased from disposals by McRoberts and Miller Airlines over in WA. They seem to have used it for a while, but it can't have been in very good condition, because in 1946 it was sold in the UK, and they had a crew to ferry it to the UK, but the crew abandoned the aeroplane at Allahabad in India on its delivery flight, and the aeroplane was just left to rot. It was in that bad a condition that the crew refused to fly any further. So the ignominious end for the poor old girl. Now, going back to the airworthiness issues, the Civil Aviation Branch had some history over airworthiness issues with the UK Air Ministry and de Havilland's prior to the DH-86. And that concerned the saga of the DH-80 Pussmoth, which had been a problem in 1930 through to 32. So I'm not going to go into detail about that, but a couple of, Pussmoth had crashed in Australia with after a wing failure. The Australian DCA suspended the type certificate for the aeroplane. It caused an uproar in the UK, because how could these colonials, upstarts, doubt our airworthiness qualifications? But eventually the aeroplane was restored. The CBA was restored, I should say, but then there were some more structural failures of Pussmoths in other parts of the world. There's at least one in South Africa, I think, and then another one involving this aircraft, UPM, in Australia. So the Australian Department of Civil Aviation, or Civil Aviation Branch, Department of Civil Aviation, eventually mandated a number of modifications to the Pussmoth that involved fitting extra jury struts into the wings. This one here you can see. And then after the war, they had another accident. Sorry about that. They had another Pussmoth accident involving a wing failure, and they mandated the fitting of this rather large strut at the front of the wing to control the torsional flexing of the wing and flutter at high speed. So there had been a big fight over the DH-80 airworthiness problems, because, as I said, the British were quite resentful of the colonials telling them how to do airworthiness. And of course, the Australian people were equally resentful of not being listened to by the British authorities and what they perceived as the arrogance of both the UK Air Ministry and de Havilland, the manufacturer. So that was in the background when the whole DH-86 saga kicked off as well. So looking at a bit of a timeline of what happened after the Lepena accident. So on the 13th of December, the Lepena had its forced landing on Hunter Island. The news quickly reached the Civil Aviation Branch in Melbourne. The controller of Civil Aviation, who was Edgar Johnston by that time, had a quick conference with the Minister, who was Archdale Parkhill, I think, and almost immediately announced that the Australian DH-86 certificates of airworthiness would all be suspended. So remember, this was the second time now that they were suspending, or that they'd stopped the aeroplane from flying. They hadn't suspended its CFA the first time. but now they thought they had some good grounds. This was when everybody thought that the wing had come apart in flight, and they hadn't got the news that it was only the fairing. As soon as they did get a report from the accident site that the wing hadn't failed, they lifted the suspension, the C of A suspension. So 3 days later, after the Air Accidents Investigation Committee had sent them an interim report. But the fact that that had occurred created a huge furore in the UK. So de Havilland particularly were very incensed, once again, that these upstart colonials had dared to question their airworthiness credibility. And the various British politicians and members of the industry over there were very upset because they thought that this was an affront to British technology, and they were hoping to sell aeroplanes all around the world. And of course, if there was a question mark over the airworthiness of the type, then that probably wouldn't go down too well. So there was a huge carry-on in the background, a political carry-on about the fact that Australia has suspended the C of A, and particularly after it became apparent that it hadn't really been a good reason for it, that they'd suspended it in a bit of a hurry. However, what you've got to really remember is that this was not the first DH-86 accident. This was the end of, well, they had 3 previous accidents that were genuine aircraft losses. So the Australian authorities were pretty gun-shy when the news came of this one. Funnily enough, the AISC submitted its final report a day later and basically said, well, nothing to see here. In January, at the end of January, the salvage of Lepena commenced on Hunter Island, which we've already looked at. A couple of days later, Gordon Berg sent a report or submitted a comprehensive report on the airworthiness of the DH-86, and he covered all of the issues that had been looked at before and the history of what had been done. And he was still actually quite concerned about the wing structure of the aeroplane, even though it had been shown in this case that it wasn't at fault. So the Conference of Aeronautical Experts reconvened at Victoria Barracks, and of course they'd had the flight testing results, so they looked at that. And Gordon Berg pushed quite hard for modifications to the wing structure, but the industry people, particularly on the panel, pushed back on that because they said it would be a huge expense, it would be a unique modification, and really there wasn't any evidence to show that it was necessary. So on the 22nd of February, the final parts of Lepena recovered from Hunter Island, so basically it took a month to recover the aeroplane. One of the things that the Conference of Aeronautical Experts did resolve was to send Gordon Berg to the UK, which he did do in March that year. And a big part of his mission was to communicate the results of the Australian flight testing that they'd done and the various deliberations that the Australians had done on DH-86 airworthiness. Now, Berg seems to have got a very cold reception in the UK to his information, and which there was some good solid information in what he was conveying, but it wasn't well received at all by the Air Ministry or by de Havilland, and he came home very despondent, thinking that nobody had paid any attention to what he had to say. However, in the background, and unbeknown to the Australian authorities, the UK authorities were grappling with some DH-86 problems of their own. In August of 1936, so this is actually after Berg's visit, but none of this seems to have been conveyed to the Australian authorities. So in August 1936, the British Airways DH-86 was on a mail flight from Germany to the UK, and for reasons that weren't explained and couldn't be determined, the aircraft went out of control in cruising flight and crashed in Germany. Now, looking back at it, we might think that perhaps the pilot had gone back to use the toilet or something like that. But they weren't able to determine. But all they knew was that the airplane had gone out of control in flight. A month later, another DH-86 crashed in the UK on a night takeoff at Gatwick, and incidentally killing the chief pilot of British Airways. So this couple of chief pilots had at their end in DH-86 is not a good look. This really seems to have spurred the British authorities into taking the whole DH-86 airworthiness thing seriously. And remember, I said none of this seems to have been communicated to the Australian authorities. So they were keeping the Australian people out of the loop on what was going on. The British Ministry ordered the flight testing of every DH-86 on the British register, which they got the ANAE to do at Martlesham. And I'll just read you the results. 7 were found to be unsafe and no further flying of these aircraft was permitted, while the remainder, 9 in all, were considered to be sufficiently safe to continue flying, but under quite restrictive conditions, including no night flying. Now, if that's not a damning indictment of the airworthiness of the aircraft, I don't know what is. In the UK, the de Havillands later on modified the further production of DH-86s with these to produce the DH-86B with these additional finlets on the ends of the tailplane, and that seems to have finally cured the directional stability problems of the aircraft. So the DH-86Bs seem to have been a much better and much safer aircraft than the earlier DH-86s, but there was a DH-86B, Carpenters had one in Australia that had the fins, but the older ones were never required to be retrofitted with these fin extensions. So in the UK, just let me go back. So in the UK, the DH-86s and DH-86As on the UK register were required to be modified. So the next part of the saga, and this is where the consequences start to fly a bit further. In 1936, the Department of Defence reversed its operation. Sorry, I think I should say Department of Civil Aviation there. No, I take that back. It was the Department of Defence because it was the Civil Aviation branch of the Department of Defence and the RAAF. So both of those branches or parts of the Department of Defence had opposed the use of flying boats for the Empire Air Mail scheme for reasons which I won't go into here, but they reversed their opposition to the use of those flying boats. However, one of the consequences of what had gone before with the DH-86 and the PUS moths was that the Civil Aviation Board, as it became by then, were very cautious about the airworthiness arrangements for the Empire flying boats. Now, that's a whole another topic I can talk at length about, but so I won't bore you with it right now. But suffice to say that these lingering problems that had sorry, I can hear an echo there. These lingering problems with the DH-86 and the PUS moth the Empire flying boats as well. Now, there was one further consequence of the Lepena accident that also had very far-reaching, had very far-reaching consequences. So while Lepena was still stuck on Hunter Island in December 1935, the Australian government had reversed its ban on the import of airliners from America, from the USA, partly at thanks to the lobbying by Edgar Johnston, the controller of civil aviation, and also people from the industry. And Hollimans announced on 28th of December 1935 their first Douglas DC-2 purchase, and they were going to use that on the Bass Strait service. So they were going to replace the DH-86s, which of course they'd had a fairly sorry history with by then, with these new all-metal, much more powerful, much more comfortable accessible aircraft and faster from the USA. On the 5th of May 1936, so not that long after, just after Lepena had been recovered from Hunter Island, the first DC-2, the Bungana, entered service with Australian National Airways. And this can be considered to mark a fundamental turn away from the British Empire for Australia's airliner purchases. And in fact, there wasn't a major airliner purchased again from the British airliner up until today, from Britain, I should say. So we do have Airbuses, which are partly made in Britain. We've had a few things like Ambassadors and so on that were made in the UK, but by and large, the Australian airlines turned away from Britain towards America for the purchase of their airliners for the next 60, 70 years. So it had a huge consequence in terms of the airplanes that we used in Australia. And that pretty much brings me to the end of my presentation. So I'm happy to answer any questions. I think everyone's still muted there.
How about the Vickers Viscounts? We've got quite a few of them.
Oh, yeah, sorry, the Viscounts, you're right. I forgot about the Viscounts.
Oh, yeah, sorry, the Viscounts, you're right. I forgot about the Viscounts.
Viscount's probably more of an exception rather than the rule.
Well, that's true.
And Dove and Heron.
Yeah, would you really call them major airliners?
Conair, dude. Bushies, dude, I think.
I'm not saying there weren't any, but they certainly weren't used as trunk airliners.
Oh, agreed, yeah, no. The Viscount, yeah.
Bill, would you care to comment on the impact of all this on the Australian government, especially in terms of the pressure that it was under to allow the Dutch to fly to Australia?
Look, I don't know that there is any connection between the DH-86 airworthiness issues and the Dutch flying to Australia, Noel. The Dutch were obviously pressing to be allowed to fly into Australia, but it was more, as you know, the trade-off to allow the flying boats to operate through the Netherlands East Indies that finally caused the Australian and British governments to allow them to come here.
Yes.
I believe another DH-86 off Qantas sprang near Archerfield. Qantas was trying to say that wasn't an airworthiness problem, but I think they found the rudder some fair distance from the rest of the airframe.
Yeah, so that was another one that crashed out of control after takeoff. It had gone into I thought it had gone into a thunderstorm, but I don't know that that was ever proven. But I think there's a pretty good chance that that was also a loss of control due to directional stability problems. And that was the one that I was referring to, that Lepena was taken back out of the Air Force for during the war to replace that aircraft.
With the one that crashed on its way out to be delivered, your photos showed that they'd been also carrying an engine aboard, and that looked to have been more at the rear of the plane. Did that have any impact?
Look, it wouldn't have helped with the centre of gravity. In fact, Lester Brain had exactly the same problem when he ferried the first one out. They had a spare engine in the back of that. And when he took off in the UK from, I've forgotten where he took off from, I don't think it was Hatfield, but anyway, he found the aeroplane was almost uncontrollable because the centre of gravity was so far aft. And he worked out that they had actually miscalculated the centre of gravity position in the loading diagrams that they were using for the aircraft. I think they had the wrong moment arm for part of it. So the airplane had been misloaded with a way aft C of G, which obviously didn't help. but they landed in France and they restowed everything with the CFG much further forward. But they still had that problem coming out of, it was Tripoli, sorry, just remembered, climbing out of Tripoli when Lester Brain went down the back. His weight down the back was enough to cause the aircraft to go out of control. I'm just looking at some of the things people have put online here. There was Sid Marshall's hangar. Somebody asked. Roderick, you asked about a DH-86 that went down in New South Wales 3 years ago. It was actually a DH-84 Dragon and it crashed in Queensland.
Ah,
And that was a VFR flight into IMC, unfortunately. Was UXG, Dion? You're quite right.
do you have a verdict as to why the 86s were going in? We've seen a lot of theories, but can we summarise them into what the causes were?
Well, my belief is that the aircraft was directionally unstable as it was originally designed, and it was hurriedly flight tested. The flight testing wasn't sufficient to pick up that fact, and then when it was encountered in service, people didn't really give it enough weight. We've got to remember too that flight testing and certification performance of aircraft was not anywhere near as sophisticated then as it is today. So they were still really grappling with the problems of how to define stability and control. Certification was often a matter of pilot preference and what they felt about the aircraft. There was no objective measures of a lot of things. So, you know, it was partly the technology of the time and the standards of the time, but also partly the rush to get the aeroplane certified, the political pressure that was behind it that sort of prevented a more measured approach being taken, I think.
And I've picked up it was a DH-89 Mount Cook was operating. What major improvements happened between the 86 and the 89?
Well, the DH-89 was a different aeroplane, although it did show some features. So the DH-89 also had a single spar outer wing section, and there was never any question over the DH-89 structural integrity. So that was one of the concerns for the DH-86 that actually seems to have not really been of any significance.
Bill,
I'm not an expert on DH-89, so or DH-86s really.
Phil, can you refresh my memory as to the aircraft that were used at the start of the service between Singapore and Brisbane, and what aircraft were used between December 1935, December 1934, and the first introduction of the short empire of flying boats?
Yeah, well, so for the first couple of months, Qantas used a DH-61 and I think a DH-50 or 51 maybe. So their old fleet, basically, to operate the Brisbane to Darwin section. And Imperial Airways temporarily extended their service to Darwin using their AW-15 Atalantas. And then when the DH-86 airworthiness, the gentleman's agreement with Qantas was lifted and they were able to fly them on passenger services, they took over from early 35 through till 1938. And Qantas seemed to have operated them quite safely during that period. They were, they crashed them a few times and ripped off wheels and things like that, but they never had a major disaster. But I think because Lester Brain knew that they were very twitchy and they were very, very careful about training their pilots and about the loading of the aircraft. And I think they learned how to operate them safely, even though they probably were quite marginally stable.
Bill, was there an amendment to the flight manual of the aeroplane after the what appears to be a chronic aft CFG issue was discovered?
Well, aeroplanes didn't have flight manuals rolling back then, as we know them today. Sorry?
I thought civil aircraft actually had to have it under ICANN and ICAO.
Well, there was a flight manual, but it wasn't any, the sort of thing that you're talking about, or what we would consider a proper flight manual today. But I think they did amend the loading parameters for the aircraft. Certainly, as I said, I know Qantas were very, cognizant of the problems. But I've never come across anything beyond that. And also, as I said, when the UK authorities had their own DH-86 problems later in 1935, they don't seem to have communicated any of that to the Australian authorities.
Hey Phil, Kevin, just wondering whether there's any recorded incidents with the once they put those extra fins on the tail.
Not that I'm aware of, Kevin. I think that cured the problem, as far as I can tell.
Okay, and the BA-146 was another British aircraft that was
True.
by a few people.
True. Once again, more the exception than the rule. That was probably the last British airliner, really, wasn't it, almost?
Certainly appears that the tail surfaces of the DH-86 was just the same as the DH-84, and with a bigger airplane, I think they would have had a larger fin and rudder. And also, how would it have handled with one outer engine inoperative? That would be very interesting to know. You could need a bigger fin and rudder in the first place for that.
Yeah, I think you're probably right, and also the additional inertia of the engines further outboard probably wouldn't have helped either. So I think with the DH-86, they basically scaled up the DH-84 in some respects, and that was probably where they went wrong. But it was designed in quite a hurry, as I said, to meet the tight deadline for the Empire Air Service.
Okay.
There you go.
Phil, you read me? Barry.
Go ahead.
You reading? Do you hear me?
Yep.
I missed the start of your presentation with the forced landing on Hunter Island. Not just thinking about the pilot in command, his decision to force land there. How was his career after that? Do you know or not?
Yeah, look, Alex Bain went on to a long, successful career, I believe. He's certainly, Hollyman's backed him over his decision to force land the aeroplane. And he was well aware of the history of what had happened with the DH-86s in the year prior to that, as was Ivan Hollyman, and they supported him. And also Fergus McMaster from Qantas spoke out as well in the media saying, yes, he fully supported the decision to do the forced landing, but also to suspend the aircraft's type certificate. So, people knew what had gone before. It wasn't something that occurred in isolation.
Yeah. Right, thank you.
I should probably say too, I think this story should be coming out in Aviation Heritage sooner or later, and there'll be a fair bit more detail about the actual accident and the recovery of the passengers and so on in that story.
Thanks, Phil.
Thanks. So thanks, Phil. That was lived up to expectations. It's utterly fascinating. There's some film somewhere of the number one air ambulance in Libya. I was just
looking for it on my other computer, flying, and they were flying DH
86s.
86s, exactly. Yeah, but no, they're sort of lovely aircraft at the end of a line, weren't they?
A beautiful aeroplane to look at, I think.
Oh, yeah, and as I
Very
said,
elegant de Havilland design.
yeah, and my little flight in the Dragon Repeat is one of the great memories. So thanks very much, Phil. That was really, really great. And I wouldn't be worried about outwearing your welcome. You'd be welcome anytime.
Oh, thanks, Tom. I appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you for a very interesting and brilliant presentation. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Yeah.
I thought the photographs were fantastic.
Yeah, they are a wonderful collection of photographs. We're very lucky to have them.
Yeah.
Nice work.
What's that, Brendan?
Nice work. Well done.
Thanks.
Thank you, Phil.
No worries. See you all at the next one, I guess.
Yep.
Yeah. Yes, as I said, I do hope that we'll have Michael Smith for the next one, but we'll see what happens. And yeah, so just finding the on my other computer, it'd take me too long to set up, but it's only about 30 seconds of the DH-89s in Africa. But I mean, even getting them there was a huge operation. Okay, so I'll leave the meeting open for the usual gossip, and we'll let everybody get back to the football or the election or to
The election.
the bottle or whatever.
Save us.
We're
Save
all
us.
horrified.
Bye.
Yes.
Bye.
Bye.
Right, Mary.
Yes.